In 612 BC, an army burned Nineveh to the ground. They torched the palace. They pulled down the walls. They erased one of the most powerful empires the ancient world had ever produced. But here is the detail no history class ever mentioned. When the fires finally died, archaeologists digging through the ash more than 2,000 years later found something that should not have been there. Thousands of clay tablets, perfectly preserved. A library, the oldest royal library ever discovered. And buried inside that library was proof. Proof that the man who built it had been hiding something. Something the scribes who worked for him were never supposed to survive long enough to reveal. And we need to talk about what that was.
His name was Ashurbanipal, king of Assyria, ruler of the largest empire on earth in the 7th century BC. History remembers him as a scholar, a patron of knowledge, the man who sent his agents across Mesopotamia to collect and preserve the wisdom of the ancient world. That is what history remembers. What history forgot to mention is this. The agents he sent were not scholars. They were soldiers. And the letters he wrote instructing them, letters that still exist, that you can read today, do not describe a preservation mission. They describe a seizure. Specific tablets, specific temples, specific categories of knowledge that Ashurbanipal wanted removed from circulation and locked inside a building only he controlled.
The Library of Nineveh was not built to share knowledge. It was built to contain it. What looks like the ancient world's greatest act of intellectual generosity was actually its most sophisticated act of censorship. And the mechanism Ashurbanipal used to make sure no one ever figured that out is the part of this story that will genuinely disturb you. Because it was not destroyed when Nineveh burned, it survived. And every major empire that came after him used it. To understand what Ashurbanipal built, you have to understand what he was born into. Assyria in the 7th century BC was not just an empire, it was a machine. A military administrative machine that had spent 3 centuries perfecting the art of total domination. Conquered cities were not just looted, they were processed. Populations were deported, administrators were installed, local records were seized and replaced with Assyrian records. This was standard Assyrian operating procedure. Ashurbanipal was born into a dynasty that had already turned erasure into policy. But he was different from his predecessors in one specific way. He could read. This sounds like a minor detail. It was not. In the ancient Near East, literacy was a priestly function. Kings did not read, kings commanded. The scribes read for them. Ashurbanipal broke that boundary deliberately. He trained with scribes. He learned cuneiform. He could read the omens himself. And when you understand what the omens actually were, you understand why that mattered. In ancient Mesopotamia, the omen texts were not superstition. They were a political technology. Tablets called Enuma Anu Enlil tracked celestial events and matched them to historical outcomes. If the moon behaved in a certain way, a king would fall. If a particular star rose at a particular angle, a dynasty would end. These were not metaphors. The priests who held these tablets held political power, because the man who controlled the interpretation of omens controlled the legitimacy of the throne. Ashurbanipal understood this better than any king before him. He had spent his childhood watching court priests use omen interpretation to influence his father's decisions. He had watched advisors rise and fall based on whose reading of the stars happened to align with whose political agenda. And he had made a decision. He was never going to be that vulnerable again. But here is what history never told you about how he solved that problem. He did not destroy the priests. He did not burn the omen texts. He did something far more controlled, far more permanent. He built a library. And he made sure that every tablet in it, every piece of knowledge that could threaten a king, was a tablet no one else could access anymore. The construction of the Library of Nineveh was not a cultural project. It was a political operation. And the way it was executed is the part of this story that most historians still do not want to say out loud. The letters exist. That is the first thing you need to understand. Ashurbanipal's orders to his agents in the field were written down. Clay tablets do not burn easily. And what those letters describe is not a library acquisition program. Listen to what he actually wrote. He instructed his agents to enter specific temple archives and seize tablets that were not offered voluntarily. He specified categories: omen series, ritual texts, astronomical records, medical incantation sequences. He instructed agents to take everything in those categories, regardless of whether the temple priests consented. And he included a specific instruction that most translations quietly soften. Do not let the priests keep copies. Read that again. Do not let the priests keep copies. This was not scholarship. This was the systematic removal of the tools that temple priests used to challenge royal authority. But here is what they did not tell you. Ashurbanipal did not just take the tablets. He left replacements. This is the detail that makes this story genuinely disturbing. When his agents seized the original tablets from provincial temples, they left behind substitute documents. Incomplete versions, deliberately altered texts, omen series with key passages removed or rewritten. The provincial priests kept working. They kept performing their rituals. They kept reading their omens. But the texts they were reading had been quietly edited. The interpretations that could threaten a king had been removed. The priests did not know. We know because when archaeologists compared the provincial temple copies to the Nineveh originals, the differences were not accidental. They were systematic. The same passages, the same categories of dangerous interpretation, removed every time. This was a state-level disinformation campaign running across an entire empire simultaneously in the 7th century BC. Now, think about what that required. This was not one man with a plan. This was a bureaucracy. Ashurbanipal had to train scribes who could identify which passages were politically dangerous. He had to organize agents capable of entering temple archives without triggering revolt. He had to produce convincing replacement documents that provincial priests would accept as legitimate. And he had to maintain operational security across an empire that stretched from Egypt to Persia for decades. There is a word for the office that managed this operation. It is not a word most history books use in this context, but the administrative record of Assyria is clear. The operation ran through the royal scriptorium, the same office that produced official royal correspondence, treaty documents, and diplomatic records. The censorship infrastructure and the legitimacy infrastructure were the same office. That was not an accident. That was the architecture. But here is what they did not tell you about the scribes who ran it. They knew. Not all of them, but enough. The senior scribes of the Nineveh Library were among the most educated men in the ancient world. They could read the originals. They could read the replacements. They knew the difference. And there is evidence, fragmentary, disputed by some scholars, but present, that at least one senior scribe attempted to document what was happening. Not overtly. He embedded discrepancies, small errors in cataloguing, cross-references that led nowhere. A trail, if you knew to look for one. Whether he survived is not recorded. What is recorded is that the category of tablets he was responsible for cataloguing was the category most heavily altered. Make of that what you will. The operation ran for decades, and when Nineveh fell in 612 BC, the Babylonians and the Medes who burned it did not know they were burning the most sophisticated censorship archive the ancient world had ever produced. They thought they were destroying a library. They were actually destroying the evidence.
Here is the part that will genuinely unsettle you. The Library of Nineveh was rediscovered in 1849. Austin Henry Layard, British archaeologist, excavating the ruins of Nineveh outside modern Mosul. He found the tablets, thousands of them, fired hard by the very flames that destroyed the palace. He shipped them to the British Museum, where they sit today. For the next 150 years, scholars celebrated the find. The Epic of Gilgamesh was in there, ancient flood narratives, medical texts, astronomical records, the greatest treasure of ancient Mesopotamian knowledge ever recovered. That was the story. But in the 1980s and 1990s, a small number of Assyriologists began comparing the Nineveh tablets systematically against the provincial temple copies that had also survived in fragments across Iraq and Iran.
And they found the discrepancies, the same passages, the same categories, the same systematic alterations. Some published their findings in academic journals. None of it crossed into popular history. None of it appeared in the museum displays. The British Museum still describes the Library of Nineveh primarily as a preservation achievement. The censorship mechanism is not the headline. It is a footnote, if it appears at all. Think about what that means. The library Ashurbanipal built to contain dangerous knowledge is still containing it. The reframing he constructed 2,600 years ago is still the frame. We recovered the archive. We kept his story about it. That is not an accident of history. That is the mechanism still working.
The most disturbing thing about Ashurbanipal's library is not what he removed from it. It is that the removal is still not the story anyone is telling. You are watching a channel that is one of the only places on the internet where this specific framing exists. That is not a boast. That is a data point about how good the original burial was. Why did he do it? The easy answer is power. But power is not a psychology, it is an outcome. Ashurbanipal's specific psychology is documented in his own words. He left inscriptions, annals, personal correspondence. And what they reveal is not a tyrant who feared knowledge. They reveal a man who feared instability above everything else.
He had watched his father's reign nearly collapse under a succession crisis. He had a brother, Shamash-shum-ukin, appointed co-ruler of Babylon. That arrangement lasted 17 years before his brother launched a full rebellion, a civil war that split the empire and came close to destroying it. Ashurbanipal won, but the experience calcified something in him. Every tool that could be used to question a king's legitimacy had to be controlled. The omens, the priestly interpretations, the ancient succession texts that defined what made a ruler valid. He was not anti-knowledge, he was anti-uncontrolled knowledge. Modern psychology has a framework for this pattern. It appears in organizational behavior research, in authoritarian leadership studies, in the forensic psychology of institutional control.
The actor who centralizes information does not do so out of ignorance. They do so out of a highly accurate understanding of how information functions as power. Ashurbanipal was not afraid of books. He was afraid of the specific people who knew how to use certain books in ways he could not predict or counter. And his solution was not destruction. Destruction leaves traces. Destruction creates martyrs. Destruction tells the story of what was lost. His solution was substitution. Give them something that looks like the real thing. Make the replacement indistinguishable from the original. Let them keep their rituals. Let them keep their practices. Just quietly remove the teeth. This is not a 7th century BC psychology. This is a pattern that appears in every major institutional power structure in recorded history. The playbook did not originate with Ashurbanipal, but he is the earliest documented case where we can forensically trace the mechanism step by step. That is why this story matters, not because it is old, because it is still running. The Library of Nineveh sits in the British Museum. 30,000 tablets. Scholars have been studying them for 170 years, and the official story is still preservation. There is one category of tablet that has never been fully published, a set of omen series from the Nineveh collection that Assyriologists have flagged as anomalous since the 1970s. Anomalous, meaning they do not match the provincial copies. The British Museum has had them for over a century. The publication keeps being delayed. I am not telling you what that means. I am telling you the fact, and I am leaving you to sit with it. If you find videos like this interesting, make sure you subscribe to The Erased and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss out on what we will cover next.